Let's go back to our top story, the American bombing in Iraq and Syria. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi has responded. Take a listen.
Before, whenever the Americans wanted to talk to Iran, like any other country, they said that the military option is on the table. Now, you do not hear these words anymore. They even say we have no intention of any conflict with Iran. This is the power of our religious people who are always present, which are considered so important for our country. Our armed forces are powerful and are always present. We have said many times we will not initiate any war, but if anyone wants to bully us, Iran will respond firmly.
I'm joined in studio by Dan Perry, international affairs analyst and the former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press. Dan, thanks so much for coming in. Dan, a tweet by the President of the United States says that the United States doesn't want war. Iran says they don't want war. So what's happening here?
Well, both of them can't be right. Iran doesn't want to be implicated in the war that it, in fact, carries out through proxies. And the question is whether the world has the ability and a willingness to call that bluff. The Americans are calibrating between their two needs, one to deliver a message that is effective and the other to not cause a massive escalation that they genuinely don't want. The thing about Israel's war in Gaza, by the way, that Israel no longer is calibrating. October 7th changed many things, including the notion of avoiding catastrophe. Israel's willing to risk catastrophe in order to achieve its goals. I don't think America is quite yet, after the deaths of 3 soldiers in Jordan, which it blames on Iran. But what this clearly is the potential for escalation. I would take Iranian denials not at face value. I would say that their protestations of innocence have, it's a question of implausible deniability.
And that's the case. So let's talk about the fact that the Iraqis have asked the chargé d'affaires, the American chargé d'affaires, to come in, but meanwhile they were told in advance that this was going to happen.
Iraq is not occupied by Iran, but it's very much under the influence of Iran. It's a Shiite government. They allow Shiite militias to run riot. They don't have control over a third of their country. I mean, whatever Iraq says basically is always with a view to not upsetting Iran, and with the need of the Shiite-led government to be aligned with Iran. It's a little bit rich to hear Iran talking about the sovereignty of Syria and Iraq when, I mean, good Lord, their interference around the entire region from Yemen to Lebanon is legion, shameless, and sadly effective.
But there's also, let's go back to the United States for a moment, because there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of screaming from the Republicans, both in the Senate Armed Services Committee, in Congress from the Republicans, saying 2 things. One, too late. It should have been done long ago, and then also you're not doing enough. There's one senator from Mississippi who basically said what you're giving the Iranians is more of a slap on the wrist than not a punch in the nose.
I think that's undeniable. The hope on the administration side is that the slap in the wrist will somehow suffice, both to mollify the demands in the U.S. for some kind of response and to cause the Iranians to step back a little bit. I have doubt whether that will be effective, frankly. But I have sympathy also for the reluctance to engage in full-scale and direct war with Iran.
But there's also this notion that maybe the best way for the Americans to handle it is much the way that the Trump administration did back a few years back, where they did surgical strikes. They killed Soleimani just as a one-drop bomb and then walked away, as opposed to a bombing of many different areas far away, not even on Iranian territory.
The assassination of Soleimani certainly was a high point in America's war against Iranian malfeasance in the region. But was it effective? Has Iran really been deterred? So far, I think it's reasonable to conclude that the only thing that will genuinely change the equation in the Middle East is the collapse of the Islamic Republic.
But that's the only way to do that is by force.
Or by true diplomatic and commercial and financial and strategic isolation. For that, the U.S. would have to organize a coalition that would include India and China and make it impossible for Iran to function. And of course, whenever you do such a thing, you face the reasonable criticism that, you know, you're impoverishing the population, and the government, which is not a bunch of good Samaritans, doesn't really care because it rules by force anyway. But, you know, it is in the nature of dictatorial regimes that they seem invulnerable until they collapse in a very big noise, and a day after no one admits to ever having supported them.
So that's one of the reasons why there's some in Congress in the U.S. who are basically saying sanctions on the oil industry is the way to go. Sanctions on business is the way to go as opposed to military strike.
Sure, but in the past, sanctions didn't work because they weren't airtight, partly because of China. So you can't make war with everyone and have a coalition that's effective. If the U.S. wants to take on Iran, they have to do more to find a modus vivendi with China. And of course, that has its own challenges. That could involve sacrificing Taiwan. It's a very messy landscape in the world in 2024.
I didn't think I'd have to ever quote Niall Ferguson, but I'm going to quote Niall Ferguson because he says that we are living in a pre-war era right now, not a post-war era right now. He's of the notion that the only way to have peace is through arms, through war.
That's his notion. I didn't think I'd ever quote Samuel Huntington, but I fear that it looks like we are indeed in a clash of civilizations as well.
We are,
or the run-up to it.
So the idea that that Biden is sort of this Neville Chamberlain idea of like we're just appeasing Iran just to make sure that we don't want to have a war, we don't want to have a war, whatever we do, we don't want war, and this is the way to do it.
Let me just say one thing about Chamberlain, who gets a lot of bad press. The actual acquiescence came from his predecessors. Yeah, he wasn't. He was not the only force behind the Munich Agreement. He was trying to fix something created by predecessors. When it comes to Iran, when it comes to the many things about the Middle East that basically need a complete revision, reboot, rethink, it's not Biden and it isn't even Trump. I fear that we got it wrong in the Middle East for the past 80 years or so.
While we're talking about Biden, it's election.